thank you, David, for taking this time to speak to me today. So I know you to be a best-selling author. What else do we need to know about David Burkus?
I mean, that's a pretty good one. If you ask my 8-year-old, my 6-year-old, they say I make books, which would imply that I'm some sort of publisher, but that's not really true either. My mission is I'm trying to make work suck less. I'm trying to make the experience of work for most people more enjoyable. And that usually means drilling down on a couple different things. The big one being the manager, right? The old saying tends to sort of be true. People don't quit companies, they quit managers, and they quit cultures. But so if we can make that better, if we can make the culture of a team that somebody is on better, we can make their experience of work better. And I think that's too important. Work is too central to our lives to have it be something that drains us. Work is too much of a focus of our regular calendar in a week to have it be something that we dread and live for the nights and weekends off and that sort of thing. So that's really the goal. Now, how do I do that? I do that through books, through speaking, which I do a lot less of this year because, the world ended, through consulting and through running trainings and that sort of thing. But all of it orbits around writing books. And so we've done 4.5 now. And the through line in all of them is using insights from organizational psychology to try and make work, team, leadership, et cetera, better.
Mm-hmm. So your latest book, which is called Leading from Anywhere, focuses on this situation we find ourselves in 2020, i.e. working from home, most of us. Now, if one day, hopefully one day soon, the COVID-19 situation or the risk of getting the virus is like low to zero, do you think that organizations will go back to the previous normal? And if they don't, why would that be? Are there some organizations that perhaps would have transitioned to remote work and maybe think, hey, this works just as well?
Yeah. So, some will try to go back to the office. Some will not try. And most won't know what they're doing. I think the real key, it's interesting. When all of this happened in March 15th, roughly in North America, maybe a little bit later or sooner, depending on which country you're in, but right around the middle of March, I think most people did this thinking it was going to be a 2 or 3 week thing, right? Let's send everybody home, flatten the curve, and then gradually sort of open back up. And then it wasn't, right?
No.
So by April, you had a lot of really forward-thinking companies announcing that they were going to be remote first, that they were going to be remote through the end of the year or even into next year. I mean, a lot of companies were trying to come out and most were not, right? Most companies were not paying attention at all. But every company realized it had to encourage as many employees as it could to work from home, do what it could to support them. And as we moved into being months instead of weeks, it started working pretty well. I mean, it was rough. It was people were super productive at first, and then productivity dropped because everybody got burned out because they were working too much. But gradually, most people built a rhythm that looked different than the rhythm of shuttling over to the office for 8 hours a day and then shuttling back home. It was much more integrated. It was a lot of the things that we preach in organizational psychology, right? And I don't think those people are going to want to go back. So I do think there'll be a moment. I mean, you think about your average large organization, they've got long-term leases on property. The office is there to be used. And so they'll want to encourage people to come back. But it'll look very different because a lot of people, especially top talent, will not want to be back all of the time, every day of the week, et cetera. So that's why we use the term leading from anywhere. I don't think the question about work is, do we work in an office or we work from home? I think the smart organizations need to build a system where they can work from anywhere, right? And that means that some days you'll be at the office, some days you'll be at home, some days you'll be on vacation, but choose not to spend vacation days, or even some companies, and we talked about this in Under Management years ago, will move to an unlimited vacation, which gets a bad rap because it means people don't take vacation. But at the same time, if I could not spend a vacation day, but go to a beach and rent a beach house with my children for the week, and work a couple hours in the morning and then spend the rest of the day with the beach, I wouldn't want to spend a vacation day, right? I would want to be able to work from everywhere, be more nomadic, et cetera. We're moving there. This trend, by the way, was already happening. The only thing COVID-19 did was accelerate it by like 5 to 10 years. But this trend was already beginning. I think what it really did was it forced companies who believed they could never manage a hybrid organization realize that they could. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing for the organization if they're willing to say, okay, let's move forward with this hybrid or work from anywhere model. And it's a great thing for individuals because it means you can build, instead of building the rest of your life around your work, you can build work into your life the way that you want it to be.
Yes, exactly. And I really get you with the beach house thing. That sounds good.
Yeah, right. I use that example because I literally wrote parts of Leading from Anywhere at a beach house that we had rented for the summer to kind of get away from crowds. So okay. I use the example because it hits home, but I remember doing that and thinking, why would somebody want to spend a paid time off day for something like this when you could work a couple hours, have that count as being at work? Right. And, I think that's where we're headed. So we're going to see, I've been advocating for unlimited vacation policies based on trust, not on stiffing employees for 4 or 5 years now. And I think that's going to get accelerated. That's just one of many trends that will be accelerated by what happened in 2020.
Okay. So I'm going to come back to trust in a little bit. And you mentioned about managing hybrid teams, managing teams. Now, Cindy, you are an expert in leadership. I believe you have a doctorate in strategic leadership. Am I correct? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, what do you think about leadership approaches? Because I'm wondering whether there are leadership approaches that would that person will either have to change their style or they're going to find it challenging leading in a remote work environment. For example, like the micromanager or the autocratic approach, for example. They must be going crazy during 2020. They haven't got that control. They can't see that person working. What leadership approach do you think lends well to this situation?
Yeah. So, you're exactly right. And you and I know your educational background too. We could geek out on specific theories and talk about transformational versus sit lead versus whatever. Yes. I'll say this though, for everybody watching who's like, I don't really want to read Nordhaus's leadership book, which is a great book. It's a little dry. I'll say this: there were, in my opinion, before 2020 started, most of the good managers and good leaders focused on outcomes instead of activity, and most of the bad ones, the ones that we would call micromanagers, et cetera, could never separate presence from productivity in their head. Right? I can see you, therefore you're working. You come to the office before me and you leave after me, therefore you're a hard worker, right? And I can track your activities and really just focused in on that activity piece. Those people really struggled, right? Because how do you judge if presence is your proxy for productivity? How do you judge presence when you're in a different place than people? And what happened, and this is what I think was the tragedy of how a lot of people got burned out in the summer trying to make this work from home thing work, is the managers flipped and made responsiveness the new presence, right? So we're still using a proxy that isn't actual productivity. We're still focused on activity, not outcomes. But now it's responsiveness. So it's how quickly do you call me back? How quickly do you reply to that email? How quickly are you updating your tasks in the project management software? I'm going to use that as a proxy for who's a hard worker, right? And that is just as terrible a proxy, by the way, as presence was, right? We've all had those days where we successfully clear out our email inbox and then close the laptop and realize we didn't actually do anything valuable that day, right? And so the leaders who have always, even before the pandemic, focused on outcomes and focused on here are the long-term objectives. How can I coach you to those, right? So this is to get nerdy. This is leader member exchange. This is transformational. This is sit lead. How can I adjust my style to get you the things you need to do your work? Those styles, they thrive in a remote environment. They thrived in the prior environment too, but they really thrive in that remote environment. And I hinted at it with the unlimited vacation thing, but a big piece of this is recognizing the role of trust, both in trusting your people and then letting them verify that they're worth being trusted, and also in focusing on building trust among your team of people as well. Both of those things you would think matter less in an environment where you're not seeing everybody every day, but I think they matter more because they're how people feel like they can focus on doing the work instead of doing all the little things to update their boss to make sure that their boss knows that they're doing the work, which is actually a distraction from the work.
And it creates stress too. Is if if you're constantly
it creates stress too. I forgot about that piece. But you're right. That's probably the bigger deal, right?
But it creates stress, and when you create stress in your employees, that's when mistakes are made. Yeah, that's when people can't concentrate, because if they're always sort of thinking, well, I need to show somebody I've done this, then it's difficult to produce really good work. So it is in their own best interest to trust their employees. And I think in a remote environment, like you've just said, I believe that trust would be even more important, because people are working unsupervised. For those people that haven't got that software, there's some employers that insist that people download some kind of software that tracks their screen time, as if screen time is performance,
Well, depressingly, there's not just one, there's like 4. I was reading an article about 2 weeks ago about one that really updated its technology. So now it uses facial recognition technology, like the Face ID that I have on my phone, to judge when you're actually sitting in front of the computer with your webcam on and it sees your face, versus, oh, I just opened up Outlook and then I ran off to lunch, right? Which is like, again, we've learned nothing, because we knew that presence didn't equal productivity back in the co-located office. But when we're not actually good at doing everything we just talked about, we have to pick something as a proxy for productivity, something that can be measured. And so we pick the easiest thing to measure, which is screen time, instead of what actually matters, which is trusting people to do their work, being there for them, to support them, getting those things done, and then measuring progress and giving feedback as we work towards those objectives, focusing on the outcome, not the activity itself.
And do you think, I asked this of Greg Sline, I'm going to repeat this question because I like it. I'm wondering, if you don't have a culture of trust, and you go in and then you're forced into this remote work environment, is it possible, in your opinion, to build trust once you're already remote? Or do you think it's something that will be way too challenging to do?
So are you asking me as the team leader or as an individual member of the team?
Team leader.
So yes, I think it is. I think the interesting thing about trust, when we look at the research of someone like Paul Zak, the love doctor who studied oxytocin, we see this really interesting reciprocation to trust that was measured it was measured in the lab, but it was measured in environments where you're not in the same physical room. And what you see is that it's a reciprocation. It's a give and take. I already threw it out, but it's a leader member exchange theory, kind of gradual trying of norms. And so you absolutely can do that. I think it really, there's a couple different things you can do. I think the biggest one that leaders can do to build trust right away is to let the team make some decisions, right? To not just say, here's how we're going to do things, but here's what we need to do. How would you like to do it? And then collaboratively build that up. I think the other big thing you can do is go first and be vulnerable, right? When you're struggling, when you're wrong, say you're wrong. Don't say I messed up because of this. Just say I got it wrong, and people will feel more likely. So it's the combination of opting in and sort of ceding power is more what letting the team make decisions thing is about. And then also being vulnerable. And you'll see that as you do that, people reflect back. I mean, I think this is a weird example. When my wife is an ER doctor, and part of her training when she was in medical school was she had to attend an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, right? And that was sort of a foray into me being fascinated, because I didn't study any sort of abnormal or addiction psychology. I studied organizational psychology, and we didn't really talk about trust back then. But watching those contexts and seeing how one person being vulnerable about their struggle and addiction can actually change the temperature of the room and make other people more likely to go, I'm safe here, I can also self-disclose. And so that's on a massive example, but the same thing happens in a small example. And so I think that's where you start. You start by being vulnerable, and then you start by taking the inconsequential things like little decisions about how we're going to divvy up tasks or stuff like that. And you give that over to people. The term we used a long time ago was empowerment. But I think we shied away from empowerment because it assumes the leader has all the power. And that's actually never been true. Talent's always had the power. So those two things, I think you do that on a consistent basis, build a lot of trust between not only yourself and each of your individual teammates, but the team itself.
Yes. Yeah. I think admitting when you're wrong. And I also think that going through the transition to remote work, a lot of people are just playing it by ear because, like you said at the beginning, we all thought that this was just a short term. It was 2 weeks off, and then it was 4 weeks, and then suddenly it's like we don't know when this is going to end. And here we are today, 1st of December, most of us still working from home. So I think also with talking about trust, I think you have to be consistent, or try as far as you can to be consistent as a leader, because and also to admit when things are going to change. Like if you keep writing emails saying you should be doing this, and then 2 minutes later you should be doing that, and it's completely different, then the next week you should be doing this, it's like you're changing, you're moving the goalposts of every single email, and at the same time not saying there's been a change. You're just kind of admonishing people for not having done something that you said they shouldn't do. So I do think consistency also breeds trust.
Yeah, there's a delicate balance here, though, right? Because as you probably figured out, everyone is building their work home life a little bit differently. And so, check-ins or little feedback sessions with a boss and an employee used to be fairly standard when we were all in the same office, right? It was the management by walking around and I'll come drop in. And now different people want to be checked in on differently, right? More tenured employees and also those who aren't as confident in their skills want a lot more coaching and a lot more frequent sessions. Long-term or highly skilled employees want to, I just want to send you an email on Friday saying, here's what I worked on all this week, right? And so you have to be careful. The consistency thing is interesting because it's more about that consistency over time, like you were talking about, in not changing your tune and changing your expectations and changing the rules and that sort of thing. But you will have to deal with the fact that you can't actually manage each individual person the same way anymore. You can manage them equally. You just can't manage them the same, right? Because it doesn't necessarily work, because everybody's built their relationship with their work a little bit differently now that they don't have to be in one place for 8 hours a day.
Yes. And people, you have to also temper that with, you've got different roles, different work. You've got creative work as opposed to some a different type of work. And these all have different needs and different support needs. And in terms of COVID-19 and the things that may be happening surrounding each person with their families, you, as a leader, you need to check whether everybody's personal needs are being met in this specific, very different and difficult situation. So that brings me on to another question. How important is emotional intelligence, leading with emotional intelligence in the time of COVID-19?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one, right? Because there's a lot of things that we do that actually, so obviously it's important. It was always important, right? At the same time, our communication has shifted, much more asynchronous, text-based communication, which is horrible for conveying emotions, right? Much more Zoom calls. And there's actually some interesting research that suggests that video calls are worse than telephone calls for empathic accuracy, right? So the ability to judge the other person's emotions, which is a core one of the 4 core elements of emotional intelligence. So it's always been important. It's obviously more important now. And at the same time, we've thrown a bunch of extra road hazards in there to make it more difficult to do. Right. And so what I encourage a lot of people to pay attention to in terms of emotional intelligence, the 2 big things I think you want to look out for on your team are conflict that you sense arising in those group meetings. So you've got to be able to pay attention to the emotion that's going on in all of the little boxes and who on the team might be. And this is really hard, right? Because most of us on a Zoom call, like, we check our hair more often than we look at the facial expressions of people on our team, right? Just this weird thing we have with cameras and being able to see the preview of us on the camera, right? But you want to be watching that. You want to be listening for whether or not conflict, and you want to be quick to get those people together right after some sort of tense exchange happens and sort of help facilitate the resolution for that context. So that's one. The second thing I think a lot of leaders, and especially now, like this is mostly important now as we move into a world where it's safer and people are more opting to work from anywhere instead of being forced to lock down and work from anywhere. You want to be looking out for changes in people's communication patterns, right? This is a really strong shift that emotions or mental health has changed. This is a really strong indicator. If the person used to be really frequently communicating and then just dropped off, something probably happened. And actually the reverse is true too. If the person used to be fairly light communicator and all of a sudden is super active in the project management software, the Slack channel, the email threads, whatever, that could actually be a sign that they're using work to compensate for something else that's going on stressful in their life. So that's, I mean, emotional intelligence, yes, it's never been more important. It's never been harder to use in this remote context. But I think if you look out for those two things, you'll start to get a read for how people are expressing emotions on your team, and you'll avoid the really, really big sinkholes that you could fall into as you and the team sort of feel out this new remote world.
And those are all important points. And talking about in terms of how the personal leadership role needs to be attuned to his or her employees. But what about when people are communicating now, it's largely by email. And so I feel that people have to really take so much more care in the written word as well as the spoken word, because we do not have that large part of communication and body language to help us along with what somebody's really trying to say or what their mood is. And of course, in a Zoom call like this one, you only have head and shoulders. And also there's the fact you might have a really bad webcam like I do, and you may not even be able to see that. You may not even be able to judge through that. Also, somebody's eyes may be flicking around like this, and you may think, well, hey, what a low attention span that person has. But in fact, there's family things going on around them that you have no way of knowing what's really going on outside this little rectangle.
Yeah.
So what do you think leaders and teammates have to take a lot more care in how they write their emails? What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I would say it's not just their emails, right? And we'll talk about email in a second. But I think the first thing to realize is that communication problems, like you just described, the issue is there's not one problem called communication for a team. No. There's actually two. There's a synchronous communication problem and an asynchronous, right? So synchronous, the Zoom calls, the phone calls, et cetera, the shifty eyes, what you were just describing. Asynchronous means text, but also the medium, right? Because email, yes, is a lot of it, but some places are now using a running Slack channel. Sometimes it's for important updates. Sometimes it's for socialization. You never really know why. So I think that's where I think most leaders need to start is let's just have the conversation. I sometimes call this let's actually draft a team working agreement. So this is actually going to be our rules for how we're going to collaborate and communicate moving forward. But even if you don't want to go that far, I think it's worth bringing the team together and having a conversation about what topics need to be in text space and asynchronous, right? Or in the project management software, which if you're not already using, there's a lot of softwares that work way better than email for managing communication and collaboration. So those conversations, but also what are the reasons to call a meeting, right? We don't want to, this was what happened for a lot of people in March and early April, was work from home just meant back to back Zoom calls and nobody got any work done. Right? Everybody felt like they got work done, but nobody actually, except in the off hours. And then that led to too much work, right? So all of that happened. So we need to have that conversation first. When we get into the fact that most asynchronous communication is still going to be text-based, then we get into the issues about positivity and negativity. There's actually a really strong negativity bias when we read the written word too. So as much as I want to say, yes, it's really important to be careful with your words, to I grew up in the Northeast of the United States, which is a very sarcastic, dry humor place. That doesn't convert well to text-based communication, no matter how many emojis you throw on the end of a sarcastic sentence, right? So taking that care, but I think it goes on the flip side too. We need to train ourselves and other people to infuse positivity, to force ourselves to read positively as well, because we've demonstrated that if I just gave you a neutral message, you are more likely to read it negative when there's a judgment call than you are positive. I think it's that fear of pain versus pleasure, right? That this or loss aversion, right? It's this idea that skews into a negativity bias. So we've got to do both. We've got to be very careful with what we're saying and how we're saying it when we're typing it. But we also need to be careful with how we're reading it, because not everybody watched this interview. Although if you want to click send and send it to them, then we can solve this. But until then, we need to know that we're going to be receiving messages from people who are not as careful with as we are with our text communication. And we need to assume a positive intent unless we've got a really, really good reason to think otherwise. I always say, as a joke sometimes, never attribute to malice what is better explained by incompetence. And that rule sort of applies here, right? Don't attribute to malice an email that's actually just a result of them being too rushed and not knowing enough about the need to write positively.
Yeah. And I think it's when you were saying about being too rushed, I always think it's a good idea with an important email to sit on it, write it, leave it in drafts, come back and think, how can I kind of make that warmer or nicer, which is so much more important now than ever before. I'm someone who always thinks that it's a good idea to have the niceties. So not just say it, put the kind regards or thank you for helping out, or thank you in advance of something, rather than just a blunt, I need this, And so there are work cultures that are blunt and they have that way of communication. But I think in a sort of isolated, everybody's working in different points of different provinces here in Canada or different states in the US or globally or whatever, those niceties are all more important because of the negativity bias you just mentioned. Because a piece of writing can be taken positively or negatively. They don't see your face as you're typing it.
Yeah.
So those sort of things are, those little things are important to observe. But I could talk about communication for quite some time, but I'm going to move on because I want to keep sort of roughly to the topics of your latest book, Leading from Anywhere. Some people, they flourish in this environment. They flourish working remotely. Some of them, well, I didn't really like going to the office anyway. I love this. I love working remotely. And then there's others that love the chats at the water cooler, getting together for a coffee or a smoke outside or whatever, and chatting with others. They like that physical contact. So when you're building a remote team, like specifically a remote team, and maybe even a global team, how do you select such a team?
Oh, interesting. So in terms of how do you interview a new member and decide whether or not they'll be a fit?
Yeah, I mean, nowadays, I know there's lots of articles that, in my view, rather simplistically say, oh, introverts are really good at working from home and extroverts want to go to the office.
I've always thought that was weird. Yeah, I agree.
There's a lot of those out there. But
if your takeaway from that is to give someone the Myers-Briggs before you hire them, then we got to do a whole other interview about what's wrong with that idea. But personality, temperaments, and remote or not remote work, I don't think they actually matter that much. And the reason is this: in a pre-COVID era, regardless of your personality type, you were most engaged, or I should say the employees of an organization who were at the office 1 to 2 days a week were most engaged out of everybody, right? So if you're fully remote, you were less engaged. If you were there 5 days a week, you were less engaged than these people who spent a little less than half their time at the office and the rest of the time working from anywhere, right? And that was, again, regardless of personality type. I think the difference here is that there's nowhere, the anywhere hasn't opened up yet, right? At least in Europe and North America, it is not safe to work from anywhere yet. It is work from home. And that creates some issues. So, I don't know that the personality long term, if we're thinking about 2021 and beyond, I don't know that the personality piece matters all that much, so long as they're a decent fit inside the personality of the organization or of the team. What does matter is we've already talked ad nauseum about communication, and that's a big question to answer. I see a world where the cover letter finally becomes important again. There was about 20-year gap where cover letters didn't really matter because resumes were electronic and you uploaded them to a piece of software that, right? And so they weren't necessary. But now that idea that I'll give you one page to make the argument for why I should interview you, that's actually a really good test of how well somebody can condense, make a case, right? And make it be logical, et cetera. That's a pretty good thing. And it'll give you some insights into their text-based communication style. Along that same route, I think you should be interviewing them in multiple mediums. So a video interview like this, for sure, maybe even a panel video interview. You should be exchanging emails with them to judge that, right? You should be looking at a lot of different medium in that regard. So communication is a big one. We also want to know if they are collaborators, how well they collaborate. And this one's going to be hard. In my book Under New Management, I advocated for trials, right? Which is this idea that we hire people for a short period of time or probationary, that we make everyone an intern before we hire them, right? And I get a decent amount of pushback for that idea because I get it. There's some situations where you can't do that. And I totally understand. I meant when you can. It's hard to do that in this remote environment, even more so, but it's not hard to ask them questions that tease that out, right? So in the interview process, you can be asking questions about, tell me about a team that you were on that really thrived in collaboration. What did it look like? How did they do it? And what you're looking here is you're not looking for the right answer. You're looking for if the answer they have for an optimally collaborating team is the same as what you see your team doing, right? So you're looking for that fit. And then the last, and I probably should have said it first, is whether or not they're self-motivated, whether or not they can bring themselves. This might be a personality temperament a bit, but if the need to know that there is a manager at the office door at 9 o'clock looking for you and making sure you're in your cubicle, if you need that to get out of bed at 7:30, then you're probably not going to survive, and you're not a good fit, right? So there's a couple things you can do for that. Obviously, if they've worked on remote teams before, beyond the 9 months where we were all forced into it, that's a pretty good sign. If they were entrepreneurs or freelancers, even if the market didn't respond to the business idea, if you could take charge and create your own job for a year or so, you're obviously a self-motivated individual. And then there's also habits and hobbies and things like that. I have a friend of mine that back in April sort of expressed, and candidly between you and me, he still prefers to go to the office and there's just no one there. But he expressed his doubts about his own ability to be self-motivated enough. And I said, of course you're self-motivated enough to work remotely. And he said, how do you know that? And I said, well, you've been training for a triathlon for the last year. So of course, like, you get up and do that on your own. What's the difference, right? So those are probably my big three that we need to build mechanisms for judging in the interview process into, right? Are they communicators? Are they collaborators? And then are they self-motivated? And if you look for those things, and then obviously, do they have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job? If you look for those things, I don't know that personality matters as much. Actually, I don't know that it matters at all in any job ever. But in this case, I don't know that it matters as much as we think. Once we're in that environment where you can choose where you work, we probably will see introverts work from home more often than extroverts. But the difference there is autonomy and choice. And so, that becomes that bigger factor. So I would stick with those three: communicator, collaborator, and self-motivated.
Okay, interesting points. So just as my final question. So Leading from Anywhere, is it available now to buy?
It launches in North America on January 5th, and in the UK and Europe, I think about 2 weeks later. And I have no idea about other languages yet. We have a lot of foreign rights still, but I don't know publishing dates on those yet. So, yeah.
And am I right in saying that you have plans early in the new year to make available like video trainings based on your book?
Yeah, so we were in a very awkward and socially distanced way. I've never had a camera that far away from me with that big of a lens, but we filmed a lot of really, really great content in and around the book that launches around the same time. The goal is not to make a video replacement for the book, but to make something that lends itself to a corporate training environment or that sort of thing a little bit better. So that's also available roughly around the same time that the book comes out.
That sounds great. So somebody in a leadership role gets your book, they read it, and then they can think, hey, I'm going to complement that by showing a video to perhaps reinforce what you've said in the culture chapter or any of the chapters. Or is it just for certain chapters that you're going to do the videos?
Yeah. So, I mean, it covers a lot of the content in the book, but not all. So, I mean, the idea here is, and you're an educator, it took COVID-19 and this whole forced work from home experiment and all that sort of stuff to make me realize that the way we do education is broken. We already knew that, right? But even corporate training and development, all of that I think was broken too, because it still assumed a classroom model. And it really, on teams, I think it really left out the most important element, which is it's not enough for a manager to go to a training where she receives a bunch of content. It's about taking that content back to the team and having a conversation around it, and then deciding as a team how we're going to change and get better as a result of that content. And so that was the goal, is to have this thing that could supplement in a variety of different mediums, so that we have a lot of different things available that you can build out. That you can have the combination of, let's say, a webinar with me or the pre-recorded videos with me, the book with me, whatever it is, but then also have all of the tools you need, whether that's showing them a short video, having a discussion guide, what have you, to do that second piece, which is a conversation piece. And I don't know, before 2020, I don't know that a lot of people thought through that, but I really think that's where we're headed, I guess, in the future of training and development inside of organizations. Is the purpose of it isn't to have an event that we call training. It's to have an impetus to have a conversation with your team. And that actually builds a more lasting change.
And better engagement. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It sounds good. The idea of having a video, maybe you said a discussion sheet, so that you actually have some discussions around it, because otherwise it's just passive listening. And so it would be excellent to have some discussion points, so that not all leaders are not all those people that are in management roles or leadership roles are educators. And so that would be awesome for them to have those discussion points, and they can be prepared to say, hey, okay, let's watch this. And what did you think about what he said about this? How can we do that? How can we do that in this particular situation? And that sounds awesome. And I'm looking forward to reading the rest of your book. I'm partway through. Everything excellent, just like my old favorite, Under New Management, which is constantly like on my desk during my master's years ago. And I thank you for everything you contribute to people studying, to people teaching, to people that are in leadership roles or people in teams. So thank you for that. And thank you for all your posts on LinkedIn and for your time today, David. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much for your support. And thank you for having me.